First story. When a useless skill becomes useful. This happened a few years ago, but is honestly a very proud moment for me. So I'm driving home from my parents' house and it's about 5:30 to 6 o'clock in the evening on a beautiful summer night. They live in a small quiet suburb and I'm only a few towns over, so the drive is usually pretty nice and peaceful. However, these towns tend to breed entitled jerks and bored teenagers. I must have run into the hybrid of the two. As I was making my way down at 25 miles per hour, I was going about 30 road toward the center of my parents' town. I saw one of those small Honda hatchbacks in my rear view that is really low to the ground and decked out with all kinds of nonsense. He's coming in hot and I'm thinking he's going to blow by me or something. Nope, just gets right on me, and at one point, I'm pretty sure he even tapped my bumper. I can see the stupid smirks on the faces of the driver and the passenger. We came to a stop sign and I do my best to do a full complete stop. I reach over, pull out a cigarette, light it and enjoy a drag before I start to move again. Must have taken at least 10 seconds. May not seem like a lot, but next time you're at a stop sign, wait 10 seconds and you'll see how long that is. Anyway, this aggravates him as he barely stops when he comes up to it, and continues to very dangerously tailgate me. So now I try the brake tab. I pull up a little to give myself some room and hit the brakes, forcing him to slam on his. I found it funny cause he had to swerve to avoid collision, but he still does not heed his aggressive driving. The revenge. Now we get to the big four-way intersection in the middle of town. 2 to 3 lanes at each stop. He pulls up beside me, and I must have really scared him with the brake tab because he looked very flustered and wanted to say something to me. He rolls down his window. All my windows and sunroof were already open, seeing as it was so nice that day, and looks at me. I look at him, and I was expecting some sort of verbal insult, so I made myself ready. "Hey, you piece of..." Before he could even get that well thought out statement out of his mouth, he was already choking on the lit cigarette butt I flicked directly into his mouth. When some of my friends and I were younger, I would just be hanging out, we made flicking cigarettes a game. We would set up little cans or targets near one of our habitual smoking places, and we all became very good at it. Now I knew I could hit him in the face. I did not expect to get it into his mouth, but I do not feel bad in the slightest. And now for the best part. So while he was dealing with his new ashy dinner, I turned left turn lane, and he must have missed his turn to go while dealing with a cigarette, so other cars started crossing the intersection. I'm sure he was fuming mad, so he peels out, cuts across to make a left and almost hits 2 cars in the process. At least it looked like that through my mirrors. I see him make his way onto the street I was on, but right behind him was a cop who must have seen him commit about 12 moving violations as he crossed that intersection. I see him pull over and I drive away feeling like a boss. Next story. Drunken woman parades me when I'm trying to help. A few years ago I used to work overnight, 11 p.m. to 7 a.m. for an insurance company. I did roadside service, which consisted of people calling in about a flat tire, the battery, or in this case, keys locked in the car. I'd then call and pay a contracted company to go out and help. So around 3 a.m. my time, a woman calls in from Phoenix for help. She's locked out of her car. She started the call off very impatient and belligerent. First off, she was slurring heavily, so I was having a hard time getting her address, which I guess was my fault. I had to have her repeat the city a few times since I genuinely could not understand her. She hated this and began mocking me and implying I wasn't from the country, which I in fact was. Apparently my southern accent did not allude to that. Anyway, once I got the address, I asked what the address was for the reference for the locksmith. House, store, gas station, etc. She said it was a house. I looked it up in Google Maps and it was in fact a dive bar. put her on hold to call the locksmith. Once I got back over, she continued to be generally displeased and angry at me personally. It would take 45 minutes for the locksmith to get there, which is actually a decent time, especially past midnight. It was my fault, she'd have to wait for her keys. Whatever. I hung up with her and googled the local police, called them and reported her for potential DUI. Honestly, mostly because she pissed me off. Sure enough, about 45 minutes later, the locksmith called back saying he couldn't perform the service. I could hear yelling in the background. Apparently, the woman began fighting with the police when they arrived and was being arrested by the time the driver showed up. Her boyfriend/husband, who the driver said seemed sober, was trying to talk them out of it. So it turns out she did have a DD. But her drunken anger made her start fighting the police that showed up. That, of course, did not end well. Be nice to call center employees. Next story. She moved out the next week. Just to clarify, this particular city, in the loosest sense of the word, it's a city in name and population only I was living at the time. Noise control can be called out at any time of the day. So this all happened about 15 years ago, give or take. When I was still a kid living at home, we had a house with a huge backyard in the suburbs. And the neighboring property next to our driveway was a set of 3 attached rental flats, each with their front door facing our house. We were usually good friends with most of our neighbors, the flats next door included. After the family in the middle flat left, an older single woman moved in. She was home more often than not, so I doubt she had a job. I wasn't particularly friendly. She kept to herself, which is fine, and never really acknowledged any of the neighbors. Whatever, that's cool. So one Saturday around midday, I was out back with the lawnmower earning myself some pocket money. Big yard. So about 20 minutes in, I was about halfway done. Suddenly, a noise control officer knocked on the door to tell us to hurry it up. They'd received a complaint, and though they thought it's ridiculous, they had to say something. It's stupid, but whatever. Now, we weren't a loud family. Not at all. No parties, screaming, anything like that. Over the next months, we kept getting visits from noise control. Always during the day, mind you. We would get visits for mowing the lawns. And even had a couple of complaints about my younger sister and I playing and hanging out in the backyard on weekends. Or in the afternoon after school. Again, we weren't all that loud. At the time, I would have been about 13, so more often than not, the boy next door and I would just be chilling on the swings just talking. Not loud, just being outside. Now we'd never had an issue with noise. None of our other neighbors ever had a problem. We'd never had noise control called before now. So we asked around. It was fairly obvious at this point that the snobby cow that had moved into the flat next door was doing all the complaining. My father would always stock up in firewood in the summer to prepare for winter, and would have to chop it up himself. It's the first weekend of chopping for the year, and it's about 2 p.m. on a Saturday. He pulls out his old chainsaw, and it's on for about a minute and a half at most before he realizes that chain needs to be replaced. Turns it off, grabs the axe and proceeds to chop the wood the long way. The next thing we know, noise control shows up. The officers are sick of having to visit at this point, and we're pretty friendly with that by now. Turns out that yes, it was a new neighbor next door. It also turned out that she's been an issue for them for a while, and that noise control was well aware of her stupid complaints. They are familiar with her from all her previous addresses. Unfortunately, they were legally obligated to follow through with them. Next week, surprise surprise, we get a visit after Dad's been chopping more wood. At this point, he decides screw it. Why not give her something to actually complain about? A family friend of ours happened to be a truck driver. He'd drive a big rig, almost Optimus Prime level, up and down the country. He also happened to be back in town that weekend. We give him a ring and he's keen to help us out. Next step is to warn all the other neighbors who were all fully on board because, as it turns out, we weren't the only ones she was complaining about. Proceed to next weekend about 9 a.m. And we spent about half an hour getting this great big truck down our driveway. It was a pretty wide driveway, but it was a pretty wide truck too, so it was a tight squeeze. Now, having been good friends with previous neighbors, we were familiar with the internal layout of those flats. The bedrooms were directly next to their front doors, facing our driveway. We managed to get the cab of this massive truck far enough into the driveway to be directly next to this witch's room. There is about 1.5 meters separating the truck and her wall. Perfect. And on goes the horn. Loud as hell. Terrifies our cats, and on it goes again and again. And then us kids get a turn. You could hear that thing a block away. Did it for about 10 minutes, went inside for a coffee and came back out and ran the horn one more time for good measure before our friend took off. This time, there was no noise control officers, no complaints, nothing. However, she left the next week. Good riddance. Next story. Co-worker from hell gets himself fired. With my assistance. 2.5 years ago, my department received 3 rejects from another plant. I heard rumors about why they got transferred, and it was obvious the attendance issues and bad work ethic were true. One of them, it was rumored, had on multiple occasions attempted to get his managers fired over claims of racism. He'd allegedly tried to get his boss fired because she was singling him out because of his race. He took her to HR and they declined to act likely because her husband was the same race as him. And his claims were obviously unfounded. I found out later that he bragged about the incident to my co-worker and said he'd made advances towards her that she rejected. I didn't necessarily believe any of it until I saw it happen in my department. Constant talk, openly about how everyone was out to get him. All of management was racist and he was being singled out, etc. He'd hide in the bathroom for an hour a night intermittently. Quality issues were abundant, but everyone was afraid to write him up due to the looming threat of being taken to the HR. Complete victim complex. 25 to 30 people walking on eggshells around one guy for over 2 years because if he ever got upset about something, you'd get called into a meeting with human resources with some wild, unfounded claim about whether or not you were prejudiced towards him. It was all anyone talked about. The things he did and said on a daily basis were just baffling. It was toxic and exhausting, and after what felt like a lifetime of hating to come into work, I finally had an out. We have these really basic, meaningless quality reports we do when someone messes up and sends out wrong parts. Anytime he had one, he'd refuse to do it, and no one would call him on it for fear of retaliation. He'd done it to me several times, caused a big scene, but this time was a little different. He claimed that the previous operator had been responsible, not him. We checked the log sheet, and according to it, he was correct. But it did look like it had been altered. So I checked the cameras. I spent 2 hours checking tape. Sure enough, after being notified of the quality issue, he'd gone back and modified the log to indicate someone else was responsible. You could clearly see him change it and see when he actually started. I notified my boss, followed up with his boss, gave them timestamps and a lengthy explanation of what had occurred. This meaningless quality issue quickly became a matter of an employee forging a federal document and sabotaging the quality of a worker. They took it rather seriously. 10 days of waiting around for something to happen and no word from anyone. I was afraid they decided not to act, and then one day he just didn't come in. He was fired. Gone. A great weight had been lifted from my department. But I no longer had to come to work afraid I'd be robbed into one of his delusional outbursts. It was deeply satisfying, and the best part, He had 100% done this